Hello, good evening, and welcome to a very particular live stream. This is an interesting conversation, in particular in the context of the past couple of weeks here on ArchaeoSoup. We've had conversations examining statues being pulled down, and during the course of the past couple of weeks, I've only received 7 or 8, depending on how you count the eighth one, death threats. Um, So I figured I would dive even further into making conservative people a little bit uncomfortable, and today actually embrace talking about what should actually be a fairly sensible topic in archaeology, but is often one that is difficult to discuss for various reasons, and that is queer archaeology, or the archaeology of gay, lesbian, and other people with other orientations in history. I'm joined by the excellent Chloe Duckworth there. Hello, Chloe.
Hello, hi. I brought my pride duck along just to add to the fun.
Impressive, impressive. And also, of course, Chiara, who is my co-author on the Archaeosuit blog. Good evening, Chiara.
Hi.
Hello, good evening. And I'm happy to say that yes, we are now live. So people who've been asking, oh, is it what's happening? Is it even happening yet? It is happening. So here we are. Oh wow, look at that duck. So I've only just seen the duck. I should say I'm seeing this the stream in a slight delay here. So that's a brilliant duck that you've got there, Chloe. Um, And before we start out, I just want to lay out some of the disclaimers that we laid out in like a prep conversation that happened at the beginning, well, sorry, the end of last week, but the beginning of this process, really. And incidentally, as well, sadly, the wonderful Leave Westring could not join us this evening. She's feeling quite unwell, but she helped to lay out some of these disclaimers. So one of them is that, first of all, there is no need to actually prove that people were gay in the past. That's quite clear from various sources and also some common sense as well. So we're not here to try and archaeologically prove that this evening. Um, Secondly, we are not subject specialists. Chloe was just laying out before the stream, in fact, that she's very confident in the realm of glass, but this evening we are talking in a slightly broader sense. This is much more of a relaxed conversation. So we're not subject specialists in terms of gay archaeology, but we will be coming to that actually, that question as a subgenre in a moment. We do invite people to get involved in any future conversation, so please do. If you want to have a follow-up stream at some point, we'd love to reach out to subject specialists at some point. So definitely do get involved if you want to. Um, Another element is this notion that being a prude is very time specific. And so in that sense, we're not this evening looking to be graphic about any physical acts between consenting adults. We're not doing that this evening, so don't worry about that. Not least because YouTube community standards won't allow it, but also essentially YouTube community standards are based on Judeo-Christian morals, and therefore there are things that could be brought up which would be challenging in that sense. So we're not going to be touching on physical acts, as it were, this evening necessarily. And also
I think you
crucially,
lost half of the viewers there, Mark.
sorry.
Sorry, I was just quipping that you'd lost half of the viewers when you said that.
No, I'm sure there are many very open-minded religious folk out there. And actually, touching on that, what we should say is that we're not here this evening to insult anyone's beliefs. So it is entirely your right to believe what you want to believe. And if you want, if your moral code or if your religious belief is counter to some of the behaviors that we're discussing this evening, that's okay. But we're not insulting your beliefs, and therefore we would ask you to, I suppose, acknowledge that at the very least people behave in ways which are counter to your specific beliefs. And that's one of the central tenets of archaeology, is that actually people in the past behaved in very different and, in some cases, what you may consider to be strange ways. Um, and one final disclaimer is just to say that much of what we're discussing this evening is based on case studies, but also personal, academically informed opinions. And so, where possible, we will link to, after this stream is done in the video description, we'll put links to articles and other relevant sources that you can look into, but we won't necessarily always be backing up everything we're saying this evening with academic research. Some of this will be opinion, inevitably. So hopefully with those provisos, those caveats in mind, we can continue. And I guess, well, one of the first questions would be in this stream would be, why do people want to know about sexuality in the past? And ultimately, I don't want to be the only person talking here, so I'm going to invite. Let's start with Chloe. You're on the left-hand side of the screen there. What do you think? Why do people want to know about how people, with whom people were sleeping in the past?
I actually don't know how to answer that question. It's probably the only one that we discussed beforehand that has me flummoxed. And the reason is that I don't know why anyone wouldn't want to know about everything, about the whole range of past experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always something that's interested me. I want to understand how people of sort of different neurodiversities experience the past, how people in the margins as well as the peripheries. And I think that's what queering approaches are about. So they're about kind of examining those things that normally get left out. But I don't quite know how to answer it, because it seems like an odd thing that you wouldn't, if you see what I mean.
But the thing is, of the three of us, you're the teacher here. We have no hope to answer that.
No, it's yes, well, that's quite so, isn't it? The only thing
Indeed, we're lost. We're lost.
how little you know.
Yeah. I suppose, from an observational standpoint, I suppose what I would say is that there's probably something about just a general curiosity as to how people lived in the past anyway, and a key part of that would be down to, or would be examining, rather, sorry, people's lifestyles, preferences, and orientations in all manner of things. People are often surprised about, why on earth would you eat that? This kind of thing. Well, a similar question would be, why on earth would you sleep with that person? I suppose there's some of that going on there, a little bit of soap opera-ishness, perhaps. I mean, what do you think, Chiara? Any thoughts?
Well, I would say one of the more academic, informed points why you would like to know is that your sexual orientation directly sort of feeds into what you do socially in a way, because that's how you search for a partner in your life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Klassen pointed out that if you do that, you are probably signaling that somehow so that, your flock can find you. So in that sense, you might have these indicators in the past, which we probably don't recognize. And also the point is that's like horizontal social structure. And the point is that's important to understand how vertical structures form in the past. So I think that's one part of it, why you would like to look on it from an academic perspective. But I think the other part is just that people want to kind of self-actualize their history. And there's a reason why we only have these queer archaeology attempts since the last 15 or 20 years. So in the early 2000s, that was something very exceptional, and people were rarely even talking about it, because in the past decades, feminist archaeology was more a focus, although that was usually very heteronormative anyway. But perceptions change based on what society allows you to do. And I think in social research in archaeology, we quite often see, for example, 10 years ago, migration was everywhere. So it's kind of reflecting current social ideas and what people think about. So I think that's also why people would like to know. And it's a part of society that's often overlooked today as in the past. So.
I think there's something in that. And in this initial general question about the relationship between how people interrogate the archaeological record and questions of, for example, sexual orientation, one of them would be this notion of a little bit like, for example, back, in the 70s and 80s, it was very fashionable to map Marxism onto, in particular, prehistory. People would say, "Oh, yes, these people were clearly essentially Marxist," um, and on the one hand, you can see why some people go, "Oh, in that case, it's a slightly inappropriate question to ask how people viewed each other in terms of sexual orientation in the past, and especially in prehistoric context, because it's very difficult to map back modern concepts onto the past. But then again, also we're going to touch on some of that in hopefully in this stream as well. But I suppose the curiosity is there, not least because at the very least everyone's curious about their own story. And I suppose people look for themselves in the past and also in history and prehistory. And just as some people will say, "Oh yes, I'm 1/16th Scottish" or whatever, you will also have people who want to find something of their crucial identities today reflected in the past. Or the other thing to acknowledge as well is that some people were looking to validate the notion that actually some modern identities didn't exist in the past. And I suppose this brings us on to another key question, which I'm sure Chloe was just about to address there, and that is identifying as being primarily, for example, gay, bi, lesbian, or other, pansexual, asexual, etc. Is this actually a particularly modern identifier? Is this a particularly modern key question? What do you think?
I mean, I think here we have to look at the bigger structure, because I think probably the problem with the kind of many archaeologies, some of which you've discussed, feminist archaeology, for example, which many of them kind of arose in the 90s, and there was a lot of theoretical debate in the 90s, as any recent archaeological student will know.
Mm-hmm.
But what that essentially sort of ended up as, I think, is a core of archaeological research, which has remained very much unchanged. And then all of these other things are sort of seen as quite peripheral to that. So feminist archaeology, queering approaches, sensory archaeology, all these things are seen as kind of little tag-ons. And that's not how they should be at all, because the people who genuinely practice them are saying these are not things, and decolonization as well is an important one, because decolonization actually is about changing the structure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think queering approaches should be about changing the structure, but also social feminist. Whereas a Marxist approach is acknowledging a particular perspective on that structure, I think. And I think I see it in that way, in that this is something that should be woven throughout archaeological study, and it takes a lot of work to get that in. And it's essentially disruptive. And I think queer studies and queering approaches are basically disruptive of essentialist norms. So you have a very sort of it's often based on a kind of Western model of the family, the kind of 2.4 kids thing, and that's been imposed upon the past. And it's about kind of getting underneath that and pulling it apart, because there is no reason to assume that as a basis. Even in the contemporary modern world, that's not how everybody structures their families and their lives. And so I think that's really, really important. And I would love to get that message out there to people who maybe are less familiar with these kind of very sort of lofty academic debates, which can sometimes be a little bit difficult to access outside of very specialist journals with massive paywalls.
No comment. Go ahead.
Also on that, I think it is very interesting how people, like this basically Victorian concept of a nuclear family that has sort of, I don't know, gone everywhere. I mean, there's at least here lots of dioramas and descriptions of, let's say, Neolithic farmers, and usually you have what we would call a nuclear family, which is essentially not the best way to structure your kinship and relationships if you live in a like agricultural landscape. And if you look at strongly agricultural societies today, they do not necessarily have a like post-Victorian nuclear family and that's it. It's like a much larger structure, but we kind of see that everywhere. And I mean, that basically goes everywhere. There's so many like Victorian values which have been like preserved into like common perception, which weren't there before. And today we're basically still feeding off of them and trying to, get other perceptions about society can work back into like our research. So
is it fair to say then that and let's call it, for example, a queering agenda, or an agenda to actually find examples of people living lifestyles that would be counter to, say, a po-faced Victorian family structure. Is it fair to say that this isn't necessarily about tearing down any particular lifestyle, but rather acknowledging that actually, just as today, there's an awful lot of variety in how people live. There was an awful lot of variety in how people lived in the past. I suppose an interesting example would be to examine religious belief. It's very common today to believe, to understand that people in the past, people in medieval times, people in classical Roman and Greek times, for example, all subscribed to a belief in a god or a pantheon of gods. Whereas actually, it's quite clear that, for example, atheism is actually more than 2,000 years old. It's a very old concept. It's interesting how, and this is again, I feel as though we're still in the hinterlands of our conversation here. We're still sort of setting out some disclaimers almost, and so it's interesting how, in that sense, the perpetual juvenile status of humanity is to presume that people before us were much more fixed, much less rebellious, much less, dare I say, even intelligent than we are today. And so, actually, perhaps as part of whatever we talk about this evening, we should also bear in mind that people were just as open to, and I'm talking to the audience here as much as obviously not say to you two, just as able to comprehend other lifestyles as we are today. That's not to say, obviously, that there weren't times when alternative lifestyles weren't severely criticized, if not downright uh, attacked in society. For example, in the medieval Christian world, it was very much one way or the highway. But anyway, this brings us on to, and also, as incidentally, I would invite my fellow speakers to interrupt me at any point. I'm not trying to dictate how we proceed this evening, but one of the key questions, I think, especially from an archaeological perspective, people looking at archaeology and how archaeologists think about people in the past, and also actually how archaeologists slip into thinking about people of the past, would be, and this is the biggie, I suppose, would be to ask, is it fair to assess people's sexuality or their orientation, their choices in life more broadly, or their innate instincts, their desires, based on their burials? This is really the crux of the whole matter, because often we see very crass representation of what is unfortunately deemed in classical European archaeology deviant burials, so burials which are not, for example, your standard burial, a burial that we expect to find in any given culture. Often they are classed as representing an entire way of life, or or an entire um, uh, way of being, which is hard to back up actually when we start to examine it. So one of the key tenets that we learn as archaeologists, for example, is that we don't bury ourselves. And I don't know if this is too early to bring into this conversation, but for example, one of them would be a burial in Prague of the so-called what became known as the gay caveman. Um, this chap was excavated and examined and shown to be in a sort of a Bronze Age Neolithic transitional sort of time, buried in a way which was clearly different. And in that sense, the word would be, or has been used, would be deviant. Now, there's a baggage there. There's a sort of moral baggage that comes with the word deviant. It sort of implies that something is wrong, but actually, what it means really is maybe uh, something which is an anomalous burial, perhaps. In this case, this chap was buried facing, I believe, west, when in fact most women in his culture were buried facing west, and most men were buried facing east. And a heck of a lot came out of that, from uh, TV reports to the Daily Mail, I believe, was talking about the only gay caveman in the village. Now, there's lots wrong with this headline, not least because, for a start, in the Neolithic, people weren't living in caves. And in fact, actually, for most of human history, people haven't lived in caves. But is this one of the key problems in archaeology? Again, I don't want to be the only person talking, but it's one of the key problems is that we often only have the end point of people's lives to go on, especially in a burial context. And for a start, people don't bury themselves, and so it's hard to know precisely what to take from a grave. And there was an awful lot of critique from the archaeologist in the Prague example, for example. I mean, what do you guys think?
I think, I mean, yes, like you can't say enough times really the dead don't bury themselves, can you? It's
No.
it's so difficult, and I think I like the osteoarchaeologist lend her expertise to that. But I find it interesting, actually, for me, looking at the different ways this has been reported. So it was in Pink News. And you can feel this actually in the reporting of it and in the comments that people make. You can feel this sort of a longing, I think. And it might be a longing to find a mirror of yourself in the past.
Yeah.
But I think it might also be reflective of the fact that these identities have basically been excluded from the picture of the past that we get. And so there's perhaps a sense of justification, which I think is a dangerous thing. Because the past for many, many minorities was brutal in many places. It's completely different depending on where you are, what culture you're in, the context is everything. It's very difficult, especially with a prehistoric burial, to get that social context. I was also interested in the way it was reported in the Daily Mail, which I think said the skeleton was outed by the way they were buried. And this felt like a very brutal take on it. And I wonder about this person's identity being kind of picked up in that way and used in that way. I found it quite interesting.
Well, and I mean, and lots of people. The unfortunate thing is that the Daily Mail is one of the most popular newspapers in the world. Certainly, its website presence is very, very popular. But certainly within the UK, the Daily Mail is positioned as a typically fairly right of centre, if not fairly right-wing newspaper. And so when it uses words like "outed" from the burial, it is well mapping back modern standards onto the past. When we examine actually the archaeologists involved in the excavation, and they suggested that the so-called gay caveman story had been overblown. They said that actually what needs to be understood and this is something which I know Chiara feels very strongly about, is the particular context of the burial. Is this actually as much of an anomaly as has been suggested in some of the news reports? Is this actually as unusual, perhaps, or maybe is this actually even remotely linked with gender? It's entirely possible that certainly religious individuals and certain people who operated outside the norms of society, the equivalent of priests, for example, may well have had burials which weren't standard. The other thing as well to bear in mind, and this is a question that I'm sure we'll move on to into in a moment, is the difference between gender role and sexuality. It's it's a whole hornet's nest, and I feel as though this evening, this is really the first time that we've really explicitly touched on this on ArchaeoSoup. And hopefully we'll have more conversations as we move forward. But one example that comes to mind would be the burial of a woman in Burka, in I do believe in a Swedish context, which was a woman buried with the trappings of a warrior, of a man, and who was later shown to have a facial injury, a violent, quite possibly a violent death in the hand of at the hand of some other warrior or a battle, this kind of thing, which people responded to as being surprising. Precisely because this woman was apparently buried as what people expect to be a male context. Now, is this the same? Now, I'm asking this as very much a rhetorical question, but is this the same? Is this woman who's buried as a warrior necessarily folded into what we might call queer history or queer archaeology, or is this more just is this actually a more complicated question about gender roles and how people perceive the past?
I'd like to add one thing to the previous caveman discussion, and that is the point that I sort of get upset by the idea that people quite often associate male homosexuality with the need to be feminine. And that, I mean, that's basically, that's like this Neolithic culture feels very strongly about how the, like, which direction you should face and on which side you lay and stuff like that. But the point is, their entire, like, this person might be gay is based on the fact that it's a feminine position for a burial. And I really, really dislike this notion because it just feeds back into this very traditional idea that gay men need to be effeminate or feminine, and I just, it's just not true. So just as a side note to that one. And the other thing is, I get really upset by this, and Mark knows this because we've talked about this before, that like biologically...
Yeah, I'm just offering ways for you to talk.
Yeah. Yeah. No, but biologically, like if you estimate sex based on morphology, genetics, or whatever, that has nothing to do with your gender role per se. But the point is that whatever your like sex is most likely in almost all societies tied to specific expectations that are actually part of a social construct that goes with your body parts, basically. So, and people use burials to kind of reinforce the structure. So the real point is, whatever you see is like a social identity by those who buried this person. The point is, just because, for example, today we usually do not associate women with warriors, it's also not very common to see that in the past either. But the point, depending on where you are, obviously, the Scythians have amazing women in armor, and like it is very obvious that that is not just for show. So it really depends on where you are. But if you find this like to be non-normative for your time and region, then it's usually a social identity that you see. And it's sometimes, especially if you look at like mass burials from like battlefields, for example, Towton, like everyone's last social identity is a soldier, but the point is, we know at that time there was no standing army. So like the point is that we perceive these people as soldiers today is actually wrong. It's most likely farmers, town boys, and whatnot. So and that's even just, you know, normal like male burials. So I don't know, there's also this like large discussion concerning how we estimate osteological sex, because there's usually a spectrum. So you would start with the hyperfeminine, hypermasculine, but there's also probably male and female, and the intermediate category, which is not the same as the not assigned category, because the last one is I didn't have enough markers to assign sex, and the intermediate is there's markers pointing in either way. And so it also depends a lot how you treat that in your further research, and then assign gendered artifacts, which, I don't know, at least for prehistory, there's very often not a lot of osteological research, but people are like, I am 2 bracelets, very feminine, 1 needle, very masculine. And you're like, yeah, no. So
well, and actually, in that sense, you've jumped my shark there. You've sort of gone, whoop. No, it's fine. I completely agree. In so much as it is, in many ways, it is kind of irrelevant to try and ask this question of a female warrior burial in a Viking Age context, because how does what we find in the ground relate to what that woman, and we're talking often about very personal desires, what that woman would want for herself in life. And this also, I think, relates to probably one of the earlier questions that we're asking here, and so much as why do we even want to know? If you see what I mean, why do we now want to know who she preferred to sleep with her in bed? So go on.
Oh, sorry, Chiara.
And I just wanted to add the fact that even today we know societies where people can sort of switch their gender. Like if the last male in a family dynasty dies, it is actually possible that women are then like considered male by society and then need to, you know, enact feuds and blood wars and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So just as a, like, that exists even today. So, but yeah, just as a, also I don't know if I stress that enough, but I really don't think that a gender role per se, or like biological sex paired with artifacts, actually tells you a lot about sexual orientation per se. So that needs to be like, you need to be like very clear about what you consider artifacts specific for a gender, and then you need to kind of take a next step and try to figure out which of those might actually be like additional things, or like, because that's not necessarily connected at all, because people might not even have a need to display this in a burial context. So
Yeah.
but Chloe, I just
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think especially on this distinction, I certainly would be quite careful to actually avoid bringing sex into it, because there's no sex in this context. And even if we are asking about sexuality isn't necessarily about sexual acts either. So that's quite an important distinction to make, I think. But also, I think at the heart of all this is the fact that we in our contemporary Western society are so obsessed with polar opposites, and that's why we're so obsessed with binary gender, which actually in recent years has become more and more prevalent in our material culture. So when I was a little girl, you did not go into the shops and find the pink aisle and the blue aisle, and you do now, you know, and it's really, really marked. Gender reveal parties, for example, these kinds of things, you know, we're very, very keen on perpetuating this in our wider society. So
also that's technically, that has always surprised me, because where I'm from, we don't really have those. And what has always surprised me is why people call it a gender reveal party.
Well, no, it's, I mean, yes,
it's a sex reveal party, basically. But
sex reveal, yeah.
It sounds weird. But you know, the point is,
but
what
no, exactly,
you know,
it's not gender. But this, I think that the fact that it is gender makes the point of what these are about.
Yeah.
And it's exactly what they're about.
Yeah.
But you know, I mean, apart from the fact that this burial, the Burqa burial, spawned all these, you know, TV warrior women, who we love so much. You know, this is again,
Lagatha.
A form
Sorry.
of kind of feminism, I think, that that actually just seeks to offer women power by replicating male power dynamics, and so therefore it's not a very, you know, that female warrior character is not really the liberating person that she's presented as being. No. If anything, she's just reinforcing that. So I think we have so much of our own baggage that we're putting onto this.
Yeah.
I don't know how we see through that. The questions we're asking of this burial are so beyond what it can tell us. And the things that we're trying to impose on it. I mean, it's a fascinating burial.
Yeah.
But you know, it's not telling us about sexuality. As you say, you know, quite rightly.
Well, and in that sense, I suppose that there are a great many cultures that we know of extant today, but also hinted at in previous times, that would not recognise what we describe as being a binary gender role. They're often, for example, even in order to, I'm afraid, sorry, the case study actually escapes me for a moment. But there are societies where, in order to conceive and have a valid child, you have to have a third person present. You know, and this person is neither male nor female, but it is part. This person is part of that marriage, part of that what we would call a marriage, so part of that relationship. I suppose an interesting thing to bring in at this point would be the would be the snapshot, I suppose, that we get, especially in archaeology. So even if we're not talking about burials, we're talking about at the very best. So go ahead.
One quick note on the burials. There's one burial from Egypt that actually states that two male individuals have been buried together in the afterlife as they lived during their lives. And I think that's one of the, maybe Mark can put the link to it's on academia, I think. And I think that's one of the very, very few burials, but it's because we've got text. I mean, we still don't know if that is like, if that's actually an indication, because it's phrased in a very weird, not weird, but it's phrased in a way that's not like, yes, these people slept together, we know it. So I think, but just on the burials, that's, I think, one of the very few burials where you can actually more safely assume something about their sexual orientation. That's also not just artifacts, but like more proper evidence, just to throw that into the burial things, because the other examples were more like how we cannot do it. So
yeah, okay.
Sorry, Mark.
No, it's fine. And also, just to reiterate, I'll be putting various links and reading materials in the video description for this stream as soon as we're done. So the stuff that we've referred to will appear then. Even though we announced this a few days ago, we've still had to pull it together in quite quick order. So so some of it is still floating around, as it were, in terms of links. But I guess at this point, then, we come to a common, I suppose, a counter-argument, counterpoint, and that is that often you'll hear people suggesting that there simply weren't as many gay people in the past, that somehow for example, the very successful persecution of the church, and again, going back to one of our very early provisions in this stream, is that I'm not saying that all Christian people are therefore absolute, maniacs, but it is true that, for example, in medieval times there was a persecution, and this persecution reinforced social norms which were supposedly acceptable. How does archaeology relate to this question of, or this statement, this fact that not many people take as being true, that somehow, particularly in the 20th century, particularly in the post-Second World War 20th century, although obviously that's not true, people have been more free to express themselves as not fitting into that European Christian mold, which was exported to many parts of the world in medieval times and in early modern times. Is it fair to say that actually that is just not true?
Definitely silence.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, what happened in? Go for it, Chiara.
I just want to say, for example, I think in Germany, we have this like weird thing that they kept a paragraph in the law about male homosexuality. So we kind of see enforcement of these more traditional Christian values, which are also usually more geared towards male homosexuality and not so much towards female. And there's like many arguments why that might be the case, including like power and stuff like that. But
well, for example, Queen
so...
Victoria, for example, didn't believe that females would ever engage in homosexuality, interestingly. Yeah. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, but I think we kept this paragraph that it was theoretically punishable by law in like Western Germany, I think till 1994. Well, I'm not sure about the date, but it was in the book for a very long time, although it wasn't used much after the 70s, but it was still there. And people obviously, it's also interesting because it's one of the few paragraphs that remained from Nazi Germany. And they actually got rid of a lot of those, but not of this one. And you're like, why would you ever keep that? And Eastern Germany did not have the same prosecution laws. So I think the point is that even though it became slightly more acceptable, you still had to fly under the radar enough as not to lose your job or your social reputation. So I mean, that's and we see that with the current things in the US, that the Supreme Court just ruled a couple of days ago that you cannot be thrown out of your job for belonging to this group. So I was like, I'm not sure if it's really, maybe it's more open because we have more media and more access to information, which then also allows people to recognize themselves because they can read about it on the internet and then be more open about it. But I'm not really sure how open society really is, especially because currently, at least I'm living in a country where same-sex marriage is legal since a couple of years, but there's over 70 countries that punish it. So I'm depending on where you are, you like have the same things we had like a long time ago. So
I mean, it's a very particular perspective,
Yeah.
and that we have. And also, I think there's a real problem in the way that people talk, especially people on the left wing of politics, which is that we tend to talk about progress, which assumes that there's a kind of unidirectional path of history. And history is sort of there in the corner going, oh, look at this, you know, there isn't. And then you see in Poland today, gay rights being pushed back again. So, you know, this assumption that we're moving in a direction is quite dangerous. But also, people have been under the radar for a long time. I mean, the gay rights movement was only possible because there were so many groups of people who were, you know, in secret, leading sort of often double existences, who were able to come together and you know, and because there were spaces for them, physical spaces for them, that they could do that. But you know, I think even in the 90s, I think having a vocabulary, having the words to describe it makes a big difference. So I think, you know, that you could be completely unaware of your sexuality, or, you know, any kind of identity that wasn't mainstream. So I think bisexual identities were for a long time a kind of a joke, not really acknowledged, not really recognized. And now we have words like bi erasure, which is there to kind of address that. And I can imagine a lot of people get kind of fed up with this plethora of vocabulary, but it's really, really helpful for those people who are negotiating their own identities. And whether people had that or not in the past, we just don't know. So you could have people who we would describe as queer who would not describe themselves in that way. But their stories are still valid. There are still things there that make them different to
yeah, I mean, for
social
example,
norm.
I mean, there was this about Anne Lichter, this BBC series, I think it's called Gentleman Jack, and that's like, they also sometimes refer to her diaries in that. And like, if you look at that, you see obvious like references to Sappho and all those things, but you see just that people recognize this is something similar. But if you like read through the transcripts, she never uses any word that we would use today. So the point is, and it even like, if you read through it, you can clearly see that there was knowledge that someone is different, but it was not like you didn't have any words or vocabulary to describe what exactly that is, meaning, so that, you know, it's really hard to talk about a concept of ideas if you have no words for it, or no like universally acknowledged words to talk about one thing, because
And at this point, it's probably worthwhile bringing in some of the classic, pun intended, references that people will refer to when it comes to homosexuality in the past. One of them being, for example, Romans and Greeks. It's very telling that in the Roman world there was no word for heterosexual or homosexual. There were expected practices, in particular, for example, let's take an aristocratic Roman male. It's entirely possible and likely that he may well take a male lover in his youth, but it's sort of expected that they'll grow out of it, and that eventually they'll, in particular for dynasty reasons, that they'll settle down with a female and actually and eventually produce an heir. That's not to say that people didn't continue in their essentially loving relationships, and actually there are records and individuals that we know that carried on living with their male partners, but they were considered to be slightly different. But at the same time, there wasn't that same sense of there being something had gone wrong, or something that was countercultural, or something was somehow an affront to the norm. And I guess in that sense, it is, I suppose, legitimate to ask, what on earth can archaeologists say about any of this? And again, once again, why is it that so many people are interested in such topics, in so much as this question of gender roles versus sexuality? You know, we've talked about the idea of there being more than one gender, and indeed, actually, we haven't even got into biological issues of, for example, not indeterminate sex at birth, for example, and so on and so forth. There are all sorts of questions which are often very quick blue light touch papers in modern society. People will jump on them as a way of being a lightning rod to a cause. And thankfully, I think so far in this conversation, and also looking at, for example, some of the comments that we've had, and then we'll come to the comments in a moment, it seems that most people are grown up enough to acknowledge that actually archaeologists, for the most part, aren't interested in trying to, once again, prove such things happened in the past. But the question is, what can we say about people in the past without putting something onto them which would not be welcome? And therefore, actually, this brings me, I suppose, to one of the questions which I threw at Chloe earlier today on Facebook as a query. And that is, to what extent is, for example, queer archaeology an actual subset of or a subgenre of archaeology? Does it exist in the same way that, for example, feminist studies do, or as I said previously, for example, things like Marxist studies, or actually is it something that plugs into in a much more subtle way into other archaeologies? I do believe that Chiara, for example, mentioned this notion that you have to have a notion of significance in order to acknowledge to see what is different and what is not going along with other standards, semiotics as we would call it. um, to what extent, what can we say about these issues in archaeology? And
Well,
also, can I just say at this point, sorry, I suspect that given that we've been talking for like 40 odd minutes, 46 minutes, this is a conversation that we'll probably have to return to at some point. So I'm not expecting a definitive answer here, but go ahead.
well, I think there's a lot of important stuff here. One is that we actually haven't really talked about trans identities. We haven't talked about different genders. Really, we've really focused on a very kind of and
We've
already
fallen into
sexuality. I think
something.
someone in the comments also mentioned that, and that's what queering is about. So it's not about finding gay people in the past. It's not about finding trans people in the past. It's about disrupting the norms that we have already imposed on the past. We've
Yes.
already imposed stuff, and I think it's basically punk. I think
Yes.
queer archaeology should be punk. It should be deconstructing and dismantling systems that have been built on really wrong assumptions,
Hmm.
and looking at what that then tells us about all the archaeology that we're already doing.
So, just for people who aren't archaeologists who may watch this, when we say semiotics, we're talking about the significant moments. So, for example, using a punk example, a mohawk hairstyle is significant precisely because most people don't have a mohawk hairstyle. In the 70s and 80s in Britain, for example, it was a statement to have that. And it's interesting, and I'll put a link below to some work coming out of Liverpool University, I do believe, University of Liverpool, where it has been expressed and examined this notion that actually people have, as it were, codified uh, various ways of actually sharing with each other their sexuality in using material and artifacts which were designed to be significant within the community. And that's within a community that's also essentially hidden within a broader set of standards. So, for example, the example which is used in this link is a single earring, for example, in one ear or another ear would tell people seemingly an awful lot about who you were, and what you wanted out of a partner. Um, and is that one of the big challenges then? Therefore, if is to do this punkifying, is to not just impose things onto the past, but also to actually actively say, is there something here that we're missing? What if we can try and get outside of our own heads? This is one of the classic challenges of anthropology. One of the early examples would be, people like Franz Boas would talk about this idea of trying to get outside your own culture to actually examine what people would view as significant, how they talk about each other and how they talk about themselves, and within those rules, how they then counterculturally or subculturally or alternatively talk about themselves using material culture. Um, I know I keep on coming back to this question, but I mean, in particular, given that I know that in the journal that Chloe is an editor of, there's been material examining written work examining this question. Where do we start? I suppose because the thing is, I think most people within the LGBTQ plus community that I know don't just want to as Leaf would say if she was here, they don't want to pink wash. They're not looking to enforce an identity onto the past. And so, what usefully are archaeologists doing to try and decode some of that? Do you think? And I suppose I'm asking this question on behalf of people who may not be already archaeologists themselves, and therefore they might want to know, frankly, why on earth are we talking about this evening? If there's, I mean, how do we go about this, uh, and in a way which isn't merely destructive? Because I think also the word things like the word punk can sound destructive, whereas we don't necessarily mean it in that way. Um, I'll relinquish the floor once again.
Well, I believe that essentially you can never truly leave all of your culture behind, because the point is you exist in, like, you have grown up with certain things and people and structures around you, whether you like or oppose them, that doesn't really matter in that concept. But I think the more important part is to really go in yourself and think, what of these things that I am imposing on the past are actually based on my own values? And the more important part is, if you build a model of a society or theory, acknowledge why, like every time you try to reconstruct something in a model, just think about, why do I want to know that? And then if you put some theoretical marker, which we have to do in archaeology most of the times, if you say, I'm using this based on this theory, just examine why you chose this theory, because we live in a time of like eclectic theory. You don't have to use Marxist theory if you don't want to. So you have to, like, I think if you're really clear where you got an idea from, that was just an example.
Then I'm just imagining someone thinking, you will be a mom.
No, but the point is, like, we cannot exist entirely outside of any culture. Even if that would be, like, in theory, that would be the best thing, to look at the past. But the point is, just even if you try to, like, take everything away, what you perceive to be your own culture, there's, like, there will still be things in the end that are reminiscent of your own culture and your own time. So I think the more important part is to be very specific why you chose certain things. And I also have to admit, I think that if you do that, look at as many factors as possible, because archaeology has this notion with, like, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and also these semiotics that you might not recognize from today's time. So there's a lot of research into, like, how long symbols can actually, like, transpire and last. But I think if you are very specific about that, and then also include as much as you can without weighing it, just saying, okay, I've got these things, then you at least have a solid base for whatever your theories you want to put on top of that. That is then entirely your choice to do. But if you have, like, a sort of objective base, because that is not objective in the purest sense, I think you're more likely to see new things. Because, I mean, that's like if you do an archaeological excavation, you only see what you know and you're looking for. So if you're not even looking into everything, it's really hard to see things that are outside of what you're expecting. So I think if you just look at as many things as possible and try to put in the first phase, like, basically do a, like, bottom-up approach of theory, then I think you can have a really good chance of finding new things in the entire part of social things. So not just orientation.
I think that's interesting, because I see things a bit differently to you. I tend to think quite spatially, so I tend to think of a structure. I think there's a public perception that you'll find a burial and that burial will overturn everything you thought you knew.
Yes.
And there's, so in that sense, you could say, well, I could use a queering approach on this burial and interpret it, in terms of multiple perspectives. I don't think that's what we're talking about here. And I know that's not what you're talking about, Chiara, at all. But I think we have a structure. You could think of it as a house, and that is all of our archaeological kind of theory, all of our data, and it's all gone together to create a structure. Now, you can go into that structure and you can just patch it up, or you can go in, you can tear down a wall here and put it somewhere else. If the structure is completely rotten and faulty, you might have to raise it and build it again. But that is rare. That's what they call a paradigm shift in the hard sciences. That's rare. We're not doing that. Hardly ever does that happen. So what's normally happening is that you're patching things up. And I suppose punk is a way of saying, well, we're taking this bit of it and turning it into something else. There might be other people working on the same house, to extend this grotty metaphor, who are more interested in maintaining the status quo. And so I think where we're at is, what we're trying to do is we're contributing to this huge structure of knowledge, and we're tweaking bits of it here and there. So we don't have to start afresh every time. We don't have to, we can be aware as well that what we do might then change in the future. And it won't necessarily change in a single direction. It won't necessarily change, in what we might imagine it's going to develop into. And that's all we can do. So we can take stuff down, we can rebuild it, we can tweak it. At the end of the day, we have no control over what happens to it in the future. And I think all we can do is say, well, this is a really good way of thinking about stuff, because actually it sheds light on things from an angle that we haven't previously looked at them. So we're getting to see more of the object that we're trying to understand. That's a very subject-object approach, but I won't go into that. But yeah, I don't think we can say, here's how you treat a single find, here's how you treat a single site. I think it has to be about much deeper structural questions around our whole data set. And then we've got to get that across to people in the public, because academics are so good at hiding away and discussing things amongst themselves. And what good does that do if you go to a site and it still presents a small family unit in a Neolithic roundhouse, when we know that from anthropology and ethnography that's unlikely to have been how in that particular context how things worked. So we need to be doing this actively all the time, and it's not simple.
No, absolutely, and it's interesting. I find myself drawn to this notion of people tend to find what they're looking for when they dig, if they're looking for something. That's been deconstructed and examined by various people. This notion of interpretation at the trowel's edge, and so on and so forth. This idea that as you dig, you need to be consciously aware of what it is that you're looking at, and to be questioning it in a way that, the classic example that it always pops into my head is Tony Robinson turning up on Time Team and saying, "Where's my Roman villa?" And you're like, well, we don't know that necessarily there is one to be found, Tony. Calm down, Whereas, and he's asking that precisely because, as you were just saying, there is a very legitimate public expectation that archaeologists kind of already know what they're looking for. We are in the game of confirming the past, as opposed to coin a phrase I've already touched on many times in my career, finding what's new in the past. And I guess it's that but that is the challenge, is it not? Is being open to finding what is new, and not being.
I use this quote a lot, and it's from DC, so that is one point where Lex Luthor says to Superman, I think. Yeah, I actually put that in one of my works because it's actually it's a really good quote. It says, "Isn't perception more real than reality itself?" And at least I do social models, and for me that's one of the main things that transpire through everything. What you perceive or narrate, often even if it's wrong, it just takes one journalist to get a perception of your site, to then have to deal with a league of journal articles in the newspapers, which transpire there should be a Roman villa in this place, or the gay caveman story we had previously. It just takes one person's perceptions to inform the entire public. And I think that's also something especially because we like to hide in like an academic ivory tower, it's often not that easy to get across to people that, you know, science means that you can actually change your mind based on evidence. And for me, that's like what science is essentially about, that you are able to change your mind based on evidence. And so I think that's like also sometimes it's hard, but you know, it's very unlikely that one find will destroy your entire work canon. But even if it would, that's essentially the core of what we do. So
And so, I mean, we're coming up on an hour of talking here.
oh,
No. I'm sorry. I wasn't to say that wasn't like shut up. It was more just to so we've been talking for an hour, and I still feel as though we're nibbling around the edges of something. And I'm sure that's almost certainly was always going to be the case. Um, but so, for example, there's a link here that again I'll link to below once we're done here. That was published in 2002, and it is a BBC News article with the headline "Dig reveals Roman transvestite." Uh, 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 and it's very interesting how we, in this instance, come up, I suppose, once again to the issue of there's a hunger, there is a desire, there's a need that's being fed presumably by the media, or some other people would say that there's a media agenda, but I don't want to go down that road. But there's a desire to find uh, case studies, paradigm shifting, to borrow Chloe's terminology there, case studies that will change, the whole Roman world forever. This was the case, like I say, this is a case study from 18 years ago. That makes me feel old. 2002. But in this instance, this not only did not change the whole sphere of the understanding of the Roman world. In fact, I would say that actually the needle hasn't really moved in Britain for a good 60 years, really, in terms of how most people can perceive the Roman world. But also, crucially, it seems as though archaeologists in this instance weren't very good at communicating precisely what they had found, and precisely uh, what it was about what they had found that was interesting. They kind of left it to the journalist to be able to. And I'm not saying that we need to invoke some sort of police, archaeology police state where the journalists aren't free to write what they want to write. But it's interesting how, again, we come back to this weird thing of communication, because um, if I can put any sort of, or start to put any sort of bow on this conversation, and incidentally, maybe we need to have these conversations more often than once a year. God forbid. Um, but one of the bows that I would put on it would be to say that actually none of this is remotely controversial to any thinking, reasonable archaeologist who's watching this. But the baggage that comes with it, the desire to find certain things in the past, or the need to confirm or contrast with modern lifestyles, still appears to be largely what is driving an awful lot of what's behind this. And as much as we and again, essentially what I'm doing here is I'm kind of agreeing with what Claire was saying, was this thing, as much as we we can try and say, we can try and rage against the structures that are around us. We're still working within those structures within academia to try and describe things that may not have been experienced by the structures that set up the structure that we're working within. And I don't know if this is too big a question to ask, but uh, how where do we go next? Well, precisely, how do we start these conversations in a way that isn't designed, or seemingly designed, to upset, insult, or offend people? How do we examine things that may be entirely, I mean, so a really good alien example from say the Roman world would be the fact that, the pater familias, father of the family, could have his daughter murdered, or his son murdered um, on a whim. He wouldn't have to explain himself if he considered it to be the thing that was allowed to happen, usually for protecting, as it were, a concept of honor of the family. It was entirely okay. Now, this is something which is not acceptable today, but happened, and people seem to be much more comfortable talking about, for example, that, than talking about other things that they have no vocabulary really to start examining. Um, Never mind the fact that also the many people who will be examining, for example, queer archaeology and gender bending burials and so on and so forth, may well be personally invested in finding that evidence. I know that, again, it's a very, very big question, but where can we usefully go, as it were? And perhaps, as I say, maybe what we need to do is start having these conversations much more often, because I still feel as though we're nibbling on the edges of something. But what do you guys think?
I do believe that academic ideas are like starlight, and it takes a very long time from having them to them actually being in print, and then, if they can, filtering out. And the problem with a lot of the news stories is they're coming from finds straight after they've been found, so they haven't had time really to develop.
No.
But I'm going to smoothly plug my colleagues' book here, Tatiana Ivleva and Rob Collins.
I saw a link to today, in fact.
Sex, Un-Roman Sex, Gender, Sexuality and Lovemaking in the Roman Provinces and Frontiers. So this is a book that's just come out like a couple of days ago, and it's looking at all these questions in a particular context, because of course the Roman frontiers are not necessarily the same as what we kind of think of as Roman, and what's happening in the center of the Roman world. I'm really interested in the way Romans come into all this, because I think Greeks and Romans, we've always been quite, maybe there's been, I think, quite a voyeuristic, hyper-sexualized perspective on Greek and Roman sexuality. And we derive a lot of our understanding of homosexuality in the past from this. And often it's very ugly, because it's conflated with things like paedophilia, and it also can involve, I think, that we can't, by seeing a sexual act on a vase, you can't then say this was a happy consensual act. And a lot of the myths are around not to put too fine a point on it, rape. And so this is a very distorted lens through which to view sexuality in the past, and it's really unfortunate that that's the one that has the most evidence associated with it. I don't know where I'm going with that. It's just some thoughts I have on Roman. Although there was one of the links you shared with us, Mark, which was about a couple in Pompeii.
Yes.
Which I found really interesting, because they were assumed to be two women. They were kind of embracing at the moment of their death, so they were assumed to be two women. So maidens, they were called, I think, originally. And then people realised that they were men. And as soon as they realised they were men, they decided they were gay lovers. Yes. Because of the way they'd been embracing, which even in today's world is a very isolated, very Western European / North American take on things. It's incredible. But those are my thoughts on Roman sexuality for you. And a plug for the book.
Yes, well, actually, we just had a request for the title of the book. I'll put the link, the Facebook link to the Newcastle Archaeology at Newcastle University.
Yeah, I'll add that in for you now.
Yeah. But it's yes, Un-Roman Sex. I'll actually put the link in the chat here for people now, just if they want to take a look at that. I suppose as we draw this to a close, and I feel as though this really, and frankly, we haven't gone nearly as deep or as far as I thought we might do this evening. I thought an hour was much longer than it was. I think we'll have to talk about this again, as I say, more than once a year. It's not even as though we've done this before, so so just more often, more openly. Just looking at some of the comments here, we have. Rosemary Morgan, I can say that it is nice to be able to have a language to talk about orientation. It has helped me thwart unwanted attention from strange males. Fair enough. Yeah, I've known
a lot of sympathy with that.
Yeah, I've known a few strange males in my time. Could he have been what some American people called a two-spirit? I think this is with regards to someone to the gay caveman burial. buried one way instead of facing another. And I think that's entirely possible. That's also from Rosemary again. I think it's entirely possible in so much as the archaeologists themselves acknowledge that this could be the equivalent of I don't know, a religious leader, a druidish type person who may well their otherness can only be expressed in the grave in a certain number of ways. But actually, that said, though, there's a lot of work out there that talks about how actually otherness should be more obvious in the grave. It presumably, or it's discussed by archaeologists that presumably being A or B or C should be more identifiable than sometimes we struggle to see. And that may be a problem of, as we've touched on, things like semiotics, actually understanding what is significant to people in the past. It may well be some other attendant issues, but that's something to think about there. Some weirdo called Bethany Milburn has commented, don't know who that is, saying that regarding burqa, practicing sidir, shamanism, was a female practice, and for a male to practice it, he could be accused of unmanliness. Although interestingly, Odin himself practiced shamanism and never lost his warrior position. That's an interesting one. Uh, there are various other things here. Someone has said here, no conspiracy, just talking about the tendency to simplify societies in order to organise them into better spatial system, with census and overt bureaucracy, as perceived as needed by today's countries, and that's an interesting one as well. I think that comment, that observation, I think, ties into this what we've hinted at a little bit in this stream, is the fact that we often, I mean, there's no getting around it. It's really hard, is it not, to talk about people who you've never met, who are living in a society that you've never lived in, who have beliefs that often you can't quantify, in a way that doesn't somehow reference beliefs that have structured the society that you're in ways that you can't necessarily quantify.
Also,
go ahead.
Just on that, I mean, the point is that's very archaeologically, but there was this archaeological school of theory that's called processualism that mostly deals with populations and numbers. And when people like criticized it in the 70s, they said about it that it has like the tendency to turn society into a number and social structures and everything into something that you can quantify. And just on that, that's actually something we see today. Like, colleagues and me have called that processualism 2.0, but the point is what we do today is we like currently sort of live in the post-processual era of archaeological thought, if you want to still believe that that exists. But the point is we ask about why and social things, but we use numbers to do that very often today. And I think that is, well, I could go on for that for a long time, but the point is it's very difficult because you have to always keep in mind that you can't just, turn a society into an equation. That will never work. So it's really, really hard to actually, as Mark said, think about a society that you have not lived in, and that you, unless someone invents time travel, never will know the whole truth either. Even if someone invented time travel,
exactly,
we still wouldn't see the whole truth.
Yeah.
Because
could you perceive it? Yeah, could you recognize it? And this is where this question of whether someone's wearing an earring or not, or a handkerchief, or the perception of some of this stuff is designed to be specific to the people to whom it's meant to be meaningful to, and that sounds like a very ambiguous sentence, but that's the point. And it's interesting, and that's not to say that necessarily people, I'm not necessarily even at this point in time talking about sexuality. It could be anything. People often express their relationship or their affiliation to a group in such specific ways that that are designed to be not easily identifiable even to other people that may speak the same language or live in the same society as them. There's a reason that we all love the idea of being in a secret club, for example. Some of that stuff I think is relevant to this sort of conversation. I suppose, I mean, as we approach an hour and a quarter on this stream, I suppose I should just say, despite what we've been saying in terms of difficulties here, and that's really one of the key things. I guess as archaeologists, we get very frustrated when we see simple headlines or one-to-one, grave to interpretation of someone's lifestyle or someone's lifestyle's the wrong way of putting it, but you know what I mean. Someone's desires and someone's individualness or someone's personhood. None of this is to say that that didn't happen in the past. It's one of those weird things where we've set up a 2020 Pride Month stream here, and we've been talking about how it's actually really hard. It's really hard to see a lot of this. But the reason why we know it's so hard to see is because of all the anomalies and the fact that actually we find an awful lot of archaeology is dealing, and actually it's been pointed out in the comments here, we're dealing with an incomplete data set, if nothing else. But also, as we've just been touching on here, we're dealing with people's way of presenting and describing and prescribing and so on and so forth and existing, that has so many permutations and therefore I guess as much as there are a couple of pink news links. I think that we'll be putting in the links below as well. As much as and I understand that need to have something to hold on to go. Look, it happened. It happened previously. I suppose what we could say is it did, but 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 sometimes the people who are saying that this is evidence that is the way it was are letting their agenda get ahead of the evidence, I guess. Is there a way to end this stream which is essentially reinforcing, the fact that actually that we know we can see it, but it's hard to put our finger on it? I mean, what do you guys think?
I mean, I think, if archaeology and anthropology teach us anything, it's that there is just so much variation in human societies. Just so much that that's the real lesson that you get, that social norms that seem just everyday to you might be completely alien in another culture, whether it's contemporary or past. And I'm going to summarize that with the phrase "there's now queer as folk," which is a Northern English phrase, which basically says that. And I think that's what we're looking at, and actually that's really fabulous thing to get from it and to learn from it.
Yeah. Now queer as folk, it takes all sorts. Yeah, precisely. What do you think, Chiara? Have we dismantled queer archaeology today?
Well, I never thought that would be the goal to begin with, but I thought what intrigued me about the stream is mostly to have a more open forum to talk about it, because usually this area of research is either something people do medium unconsciously when they try to reconstruct society, or it is very specific panels at academic conferences. And that's where most of this discussion happens. And then there's this public perception, which is oh yeah, we've got all the evidence very clearly, this and that. So I thought it that intrigued me a lot about this idea, not to actually talk about how we search for it, but more what we could do with it, because I think that's ultimately that's the more interesting question. What can we learn from the fact that we acknowledge more identities? How can that sort of trigger new research ideas, get in new people who have also in the social sciences and wherever have new ideas, but then also how can we feed that back to the public in a way that's not, I don't know, academic mumbo jumbo, sorry to say it like that, but it's it is accessible for everyone, and not just a sort of, I don't know, every time I go to a conference and there's a queer panel, it's always packed. You can quite often can't even find a seat. People are super interested in it, but there's not a lot of people who are very open about the fact that they do research like that outside of these conferences. So I think that's really important, not just in academia, but also how to get that food to the public, and just enrich what we know about society in the past, because that's what we're after in the end.
Yeah. I think one of the things that came up in the, and I promise you we are drawing this to a close. I know we all have lives to go on with, but one of the things that came up in the chat, in our chat this afternoon, as we were sort of preparing for this, was sort of what you've described actually there, Chiara, was this notion that actually people are curious and they are drawn to this sort of research, but also this strange thing where I have some very open-minded, very lovely anthropological and archaeological colleagues, whom when you start talking about, well, could this have been evidence of, and let's just say a third gender, for example, even if you're not trying to ascribe sexuality onto someone, they will close up. They will sort of like a clam, they will. I think I described it in our chat as though it's almost as though you've just suggested, shall we go to a sex shop at lunch? Shall we? Shall we pop into that shop where there's all sorts of weird toys and things to talk about? And that's not. That's precisely, and hopefully this conversation has illustrated the point, that that's exactly not what has to happen. You don't have to go down some weird, explicit, uncomfortable conversation to talk about the truth, the truism, to borrow a slightly outdated word, that people have and do and will always have a variety of ways of living and desire, and their own desires, and the people who they want to live and be with. Incidentally, an interesting point of contention here in the comments once again comes from
Uh,
Rosemary.
just
Oh, so
yeah,
gone.
may I just refer to
Sorry.
that? May I just refer shortly to that platonic romantic
Yeah, precisely.
thing?
Yeah. So she just said,
I
I just
think
tend to wish that we could see two
yeah.
men buried together and not assume a sexual relationship. Platonic romantic
Yeah, I
partnerships
think
are a thing.
the original authors of that paper actually explored that possibility. I
Mm,
might have not put that. I'm not entirely sure because it has been a while since I read it.
mm,
I think they actually explored this possibility. I think the point why we don't see a lot of like asexual references in archaeology is because that is even harder to talk about. I mean, it's even something that's a problem to talk about,
mm,
even within the community today. It is something that is like often fights for the ability to be recognized as a valid kind of identity. And I think that's what makes it even harder to see in the past, because the point is like a platonic relationship is like you can't see that in a grave. Like
no, no,
even the point is two people buried together, no matter what position, there's, unless you do DNA and find out they're related, that is like one possibility to say something about their relationship, which then is just a biological thing. Does not even need to be like kinship in the way we perceive it today, but it's like a biological thing you can say about two people. And
mm,
so the point is like, no matter how you find a person buried in a grave, unless there's another person having a text saying, well, we were platonic, had a platonic relationship, and we are buried in this grave together because we wanted that way.
yeah,
I mean, that's not exaggerating. I don't want to,
no,
insult anyone
no,
in
no,
this
no, no, no.
community. Really, I don't want to do that. But the point is, it
But
is
it would be a very interesting discovery. Yeah.
yeah. Actually, I would love to find something like that and then just be able to, put a light on that. But
Yeah.
the point is, it is very hard to prove, because in the end, we're not like what we see in archaeology. Even if we see someone's orientation, you can have like, pan orientations and never act on them your entire life. And, marry someone of the opposite gender, and then that would feed into how we perceive these people, if we even could see that, because you don't know if someone was married in the past, if for example in prehistory. So
Mm.
I'm like, that's like, that's just, I don't know, a rough comment on that, because the sort of, the point is, it's not the point. What we see in a grave is doesn't say anything about a person's actions
Well,
in their lives.
and
So I think that's why it's so hard to
yeah,
work on that.
and do you know what occurs to me actually, and this may be quite upsetting to some archaeologists, is that what we see in the grave um, is almost certainly not intended to communicate anything to you.
Yeah.
It's almost certainly not meant to be read by you. and I find that very challenging, because obviously there's a question of what people were doing to the body in the act of burying, and often a burial is essentially for people who are left behind to remember the person who's just died, and therefore we'll have all sorts of identifying factors put into that burial. For example, I buried my dad. Sorry, I put into my dad's burial a figure of Egon. At the time, I was obsessed with Ghostbusters as a 5, 6 year old. Um, and does that mean that he was obsessed with Ghostbusters? No, not at all. And yeah, so that grave is not meant for anyone else. And that's one of the most difficult, probably the most difficult thing actually about archaeology, is that we have all these attendant, very obvious questions about morality when it comes to excavating people, but then the rights and our ability to actually understand precisely what was meant by that person's life in their ultimate endpoint is it's a challenge. And so I don't mean to end on a morbid point there, but it's an interesting one though. It's interesting, certainly. I suppose. Okay, so we've been talking for an hour and a half now. So I'm going to try and draw us to a close. Is there anything that you guys would like to say as we come to the end of this stream? And I think what we should do is maybe I'm not insisting that you guys have to come back, although obviously you'd be very welcome. But maybe what we should try and do is have this sort of conversation every 6 months or so, just to sort of build on some of this stuff, as opposed to starting from the beginning every time. But is there anything that you'd like to say? Let's start with Chloe, and then we'll move on to Chiara.
Yeah, my mind's suddenly gone blank. I had so much to say.
It was the Ghostbusters, wasn't it? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think there were a couple of things I didn't say that I would have liked to have said. I think in the terms of the burials, they could be very personal. They could also be a signal to wider society. Like you think of the kind of more monumental burials. They're about land ownership, perhaps, in some cases. And I think that's a really important thing here, in that many identities, as Chiara said before, can never manifest themselves in the way that they can if they were given the right space to do so. So do you might be very aware of that identity and be hiding it. And there are many instances of that. And the Anne Lister that you mentioned before is one of them. Or you might be just simply uncomfortable or unaware of it. It might fall into those grey spaces. And I don't think that's a bad thing for archaeologists to bear in mind. I don't think that's a negative thing. Of course, we can't pin someone down and understand everything about them. And realizing that is educational in itself, because I cannot walk up to somebody in the street. I might know, I've had friends I've known for years, and I still didn't know everything about them. I still don't. And that's just how it is. And it's a great lesson. Archaeology teaches us so many lessons about our own society, just in having to think about how we look at things from the past.
Okay. So what about you, Chiara?
Well, I also have this giant amount of notes concerning burials and things like that. So maybe we should, like burial and gender and all those things. So I've got a lot of things about that as well, which I really didn't get into. So, maybe we should keep that in mind. But yeah, I also think that archaeology, first and foremost, teaches you a lot about yourself, your society, also about the things that are important to you. Every time you develop a new research question, not as a part of a project, but just on your own, you quite often research things that you are personally interested in, and that also teaches you a lot about yourself. So yeah, I think it would be great to continue this conversation, and maybe also have a bit more questions from the audience. If we could maybe gather them, have a bit more response prior to the stream, it would be really interesting to then specifically prepare for certain questions to just make useful. It about one thing. Because the point is, I know from our document we had so many ideas what we could do tonight in this 1 hour. So I mean, the point is maybe just I don't know, maybe next time we can try to be more specific about the question. Although I like the fact, I really like the fact that it was so unbound in its limits, so that we could basically go from one thing to something else, and there was no boundary set by we want to do this specific question. I really enjoyed that. So
Okay, good, cool. I've just seen a certain Tristan B jump in on the comments. Again, don't know who that guy is. Some weirdo. Archaeologist tells its story through its storytellers. We need more diverse archaeologists, which is,
Couldn't agree more.
yeah, without a doubt the case. But also, actually, I think in this particular instance, uh, I think it's going to be very hard to say we want to employ someone who is, for example, uh, bisexual, asexual, pansexual. Yeah, but we need to find ways to encourage people to feel confident to talk about this stuff in a way that isn't necessarily easily accommodated within, say, a university structure or an employment structure or an academic structure. I'm not quite sure how we answer that, but I guess we can keep on trying to answer that question. So absolutely.
I think we need representation, and we need people. This is Pride talking, not me, but we need people who are okay with saying I'm bisexual.
Yes.
yeah,
Because then other people recognise that is a space that they are welcome in.
Yeah.
yeah,
No, I agree. I agree. Um,
and not everybody will be comfortable with that, and that's absolutely fine. But I think the more people, those people who are saying it, is enough.
yeah.
Absolutely. I guess. I mean, is it fair to say in this instance that I mean, Tristan goes on to say here we need to make the space, but is it fair to say as well that I'm trying to think of I can think of a couple of people for whom their primary interest is not rooted in their particular orientation. Which doesn't mean as well. That's the other thing. That's the other weird thing about this conversation is to say that there will be people who are gay who are interested in seeds, you know, like, and they don't want to have to talk about, or to have to bring in their own perception of archaeology. That's a weird counterpoint to that statement as well. Um, and the reason why I'm saying that is just that I'm well aware that there will be people who end up watching this who I don't want to pressure those people into being representative. If you're into seeds, you do your seed thing. That's fine. Um, but I think the more that we can have conversations like this, the more frequently we can have them, the more welcoming. For example, actually, it should be stated we haven't had a single troll this evening. That's really great. That's really lovely. We were given the number of trolls that I had or that we had on the conversation about the Colston statue, um, not one this evening, and that's precisely the point. It should be entirely possible to have these spaces, and in that sense, yeah, make space more readily, more often, more frequently, and that's something that I hope to try and do more often as well on this channel. I think because this has been fun. I've enjoyed it. And, even though Leaf couldn't make it this evening, it's been great. Thank you guys for turning up. I know you again. I know you have lives in addition to turning up on random conversations. Um, is there anything that you would encourage people to think about then? I guess so we've had our sort of closing comments, but what would you encourage people to think about or to comment on or to look for? And also, is there any links that you want to point people to that we'll put in the links below as we close this stream? Hello.
I think we were both being polite.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think I just want people to think about diversity and variability, and that's a very 2020 take. Maybe we also need to think about those people in the past who weren't able to express the diversity or didn't kind of discover it. But just think about it, be aware of it. That's all we need to do for it to become more prominent.
Okay. Chiara? Oh, you just popped in. You froze for a second then.
I think I said what I said previously was like a lot on the stream. I mean, just generally about just about representation and those things. I think if you create an environment where everyone is comfortable, and what was said before, yes, obviously you shouldn't employ someone because of their identity. That also holds true. You should not employ someone just because they're women or men or whatever. You should employ someone for their expertise first and foremost. And yes, obviously there's equality and diversity issues everywhere. So, you should not just, disregard someone's resume because they had less publications, because they had a child or something like that. But, if you create an environment where expertise actually counts more than other things, and people are not actually, bullied or anything for their identity, I think very often that just creates a welcoming environment in which also, the hopeful goal is, that where nobody has to be in a closet unless they want to. That, I mean, is the greater goal of that. And I mean, obviously, it is fine for everyone to stay in that closet as long as they want, also as long as they need, because some people have family they depend on and they need their support. So, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that either. But I think if you just create, like, if some people can create an example how open especially university can be, and for many people that's like the first time where they perceive more open environments, often less traditional than their homes or schools or whatever. I think if people can grow up in an environment like that and see what is possible, we also in the future will get a more diverse science or archaeology or wherever you take that, because people suddenly realize that it's okay to be different. So yeah, I think that's just, it's not on the stream per se, but I think that's like to have a more open environment in archaeology or academia in general. I think that's the way to get all those marginalized ideas to a broader spectrum. So
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And also, I think there's also an argument to be made for in terms of strange tendencies to have weird toys in your office as well. So there's things like Pokemon, etc. So yeah, yes, absolutely, and I think following this evening, I'm definitely going to try and have these conversations elsewhere as well, either more often on this channel, or maybe we could have a conversation hosted on Chloe's Archeo Duck YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Find it and subscribe, folks, if you're interested. Um, but at the risk of doing that terribly British thing of not knowing how to end a conversation, um, and what I'm going to do is just say thank you everyone for turning up. Thank you for the lovely comments this evening, very constructive comments, and also anyone who watches this after this stream is finished. Please do get involved in the conversation below, because we'll all be checking back in and adding to it there, and also check out the links that we'll put in the video information as well. Um, so yeah, there's meant to be roughly an hour. We've gone on for far more than an hour. It's been fun. But until next time, as ever, I suppose I will wish you all good night and take care in these strange times. Bye bye.